Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for your patience as I had some technical difficulties. Good evening, and I would like to call the school board meeting for Tuesday, June 1st, 2021 for the Des Moines Public Schools to order. Ms. Jenkins, can you please take the roll?
Here.
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 I can't hear you, Ms. Jenkins, but I think you said my name. I'm here.
Here. Here.
The first item of business is approval of the agenda. May I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda?
Caldwell Johnson, move approval.
Martirano, second.
We have a motion by Ms. Caldwell Johnson and a second by Ms. Martirano. Ms. Jenkins, will you please take the vote?
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Caldwell Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Della Yes. Ms. Martirano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The vote is approved 7-0. The next item on our agenda is approval of the minutes from our meeting on Tuesday, May 18th, 2021. May I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Sawyer, so moved.
Barron,
Caldwell.
second.
We have a motion by Ms. Sawyer and a second by Mr. Barron. Ms. Jenkins, will you please take the vote?
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Ms. Caldwell Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Della Yes. Ms. Martirano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The vote is approved 7-0. Next on our agenda is public forum. We provide speakers at the forum an opportunity to address the board for up to 3 minutes regarding items that are not on the board agenda. If anyone wishes to speak during this forum, please email aaron.jenkins@dmschools.org. Speakers will be called individually, and we ask that you please state your name and address prior to providing comments. Guests of the board are encouraged to speak to matters relating to the program, services, and operations of DMPS. Please remember that Iowa law prohibits us from discussing specific employees or their job performance. Please avoid references to personalities or character attacks, as those types of comments do not contribute to the purpose for which this public forum exists. Thank you for your support of our school district. We appreciate your input. As a reminder to the board and public, this public forum is not a time for board engagement and discussion, as it is our obligation to discuss only matters posted in the public agenda for the sake of transparency and opportunity afforded to all community stakeholders. Matters requiring attention will receive appropriate staff and/or board follow-up at a time after the meeting. Ms. Jenkins, do we have any speakers?
We do. Brandon Oliver.
Hi, my name is Brandon Oliver. I live at 3021 Southwest 29th Street, Des Moines, Iowa, 50321. I hope each of you thinks about each graduate's hand you shook while you process what I'm saying this evening. I want to again thank each of you who have taken the time to share conversations with me about equity. I especially enjoy the ongoing conversations. As I stated in the last meeting, I can tell who finds equity to be important by who shows open access. I can also tell who does not find equity to be important by a lack of reaching out and/or silence. This past weekend, many students graduated. I've seen the sincere happiness from some of you about those wonderful occasions. I don't know how we are planning for those graduates to be equitably employed within our district, especially in administrative roles. I first asked to see a plan in the beginning of March. Unfortunately, I still have not seen such a plan. Honestly, I'm beginning to wonder if the overall plan is to avoid equitable hiring and retention practices. As I said 4 months ago, I do not see the same sense of urgency, passion, or drive for anti-racism as I saw for mitigating the spread of COVID. I don't mean to dismiss the equity work which some of you are doing as individuals. Right now, I'm speaking to the board as a whole, as well as the superintendent. Again, think of our recent graduates. Picture their faces. Think of the district's mission statement. Maybe we've provided them the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to be successful at the next stage of their lives. However, my question is, How do they know we want them to return here and receive administrative roles equitably? Because our past and current data shows we do not. And we don't seem to be implementing a plan to change it either. It's time to stop thinking it's up to them to make us equitable. The reality is that it's up to us. What will it take for us to finally hold ourselves accountable? When will we continuously hear each and every board member and the superintendent say we must do better than we are right now? I sincerely want to give a huge thanks to those of you who model self-accountability. I have the utmost respect for humility. I hope not to hear anyone say we are doing our best, because if this is our best, it's provably discriminatory. Our graduates have worked hard for us. We must do better for them. Thank you.
And we have no additional speakers.
I would like to thank you, Ms. Oliver, for your comments to the board this evening. The next item on our agenda is C1 SEL. Superintendent Ahart, would you please introduce the matter?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Bradley. We have three individuals with us tonight, Dow Jacques, Jake Troja, and Allison Findlay, who has really sort of taken over the role that Laura Fefchak played with this team. Before we get into the presentation, though, I did want to share a bit of really positive news that Dow Jacques has been accepted to the Postdoctoral Fellows Academy with CASEL. This is an honor for both Mr. Jacques and our district, and we will, both he and the district will directly benefit from the learning that will take place directly with CASEL in some unique opportunities only available to the postdoctoral fellows. So congratulations to Dow Jacques, and I look forward to the additional learning that will provide our entire system. So congratulations, Dow, on that really special honor. What you'll see in our report are a number of things, but one thing I don't want to get lost as we try to be as transparent as possible with our data is the survey data. While not all of it points this year in the direction that we would like for it to go, if you compare year over year, in virtually every case, we started at a higher spot and ended at a higher spot. And clearly there's lots of work to do. We are really kind of fresh to approaching the SEL work as a system. But I'm feel really good about the progress that we're making. And you'll also note that we are trying to follow best practices and really emphasize getting habits and processes embedded with all of our adults to ensure that as we advance SEL learning for our students, that we have a sustainable model that will continue to allow us to deepen this work. In our work session later this evening, I think you'll see a pretty direct connection between our SEL work and our anti-racism work. So with that, I'll introduce our three co-presenters. Dow Jacques, our Social and Emotional Learning Coordinator, Jake Troja, Director of School Climate, and Allison Findlay, Director of Student Services. And then I think if you want to follow along, you can either look at the shared screen, or the PowerPoint presentation is attached in board documents, as well as the actual report and the data, which I know you've previewed in advance.
All right. Good evening, board and Madam Chair. Thank you for having us tonight to talk about our progress that we've made towards our management implementation. I'm Allison Findlay. I am a Director of Student Services, and I'm really honored to be joining this team with Dr. Jacques and with Jake Troja. So I am recently joining this team, and so I know today what I talk with you about is some review. But what we'd like to start with is really congratulating the 2021 grads and their families for finishing this very interesting school year. So congratulations to all of you.
I just wanted to take a second and piggyback on Dr. Ahart's comment about Laura. We did lose Laura just a little over a month ago. She was instrumental in this work getting started, but continuing. And I think all of us, the three of us specifically, promised Laura that we would make sure that we held space for this work, but we shepherd this work and protected this work. And so I just ask that we take a minute and think about how all of us are engaged in this work, but also how we're protecting this work as we move forward. If we take a second and just enter our conversation that way, then we'll proceed with the presentation.
Thanks, Jake. Just to remind, especially the community, I know the board's very familiar with this, but 2 years ago when we were working on the board SMART goals, shortly after that, when we were looking for a way to follow the direction of the community in terms of some expectations that they wanted to see happen with our students, the management limitation 2.10 on social emotional learning was created and passed, and that reads: the superintendent should not cause or allow conditions that do not support the social and emotional learning and needs of all students. And then it goes on with 6 more specific descriptors, which I know is not necessary for me to read aloud for you. So since the creation of that policy, what we've been doing is reporting out on progress toward moving the system to a place where we are operating in fully compliant with management limitation 2.10 SCL. And then, as you'll see, as we've had various conversations about how is it that we monitor this work, how is it that we measure this work. Initially, the idea was to create a SMART goal. We've explored that pretty in depth. One of the recommendations that I have made is that perhaps the more productive way to ensure that we embed the SEL work in with integrity and with the full breadth of what we think is appropriate, and to protect the work, as Jake said, as Laura always wished, was perhaps to revisit our treatment of students and or possibly the treatment of staff policies, and rewrite those, revise those with an eye toward advancing the SEL work. So that's one thing that we'll sort of end with that concept. So Jake, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, and I'll have Allie go ahead and jump in here. Go ahead, Allie.
Yep. So we're going to start by reviewing. I know you've already had some of this, but our integrated services. This year, we've been really working with multidisciplinary groups of professionals to support the learning, social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of students. And so part of that plan has been making sure that we have the right people at the table so that they can help make some decisions. So as a team, and as we started integrated services at the beginning of this school year, we really grounded ourselves in these 3 main resources. The first one is the CELRIA report, which came from CASEL. CASEL came out and did a readiness interviews and survey with Des Moines Public Schools last spring. And so we used many of their recommendations. We also used a framework for safe and successful schools, which lays out the core integrated service team members and the professionals that we need around the table in order to move this work forward. And so we've used that as a resource. And then we also have been using the anti-racist town hall findings to help us ground ourselves in what we are doing in terms of integrated services support. So you'll see on your screen now the levers that we are using in order to meet our board goals. And we strongly believe that social emotional learning is a lever for equity, but it's also, we know the research is very clear when we are protecting and we're supporting the social emotional learning of our students and our staff members, that student achievement will increase. And so we know that social emotional learning really aligns with all of the levers, not just the social emotional learning lever. So one of those levers is access. And in the access lever, one way that SEL and the integrated services is aligning with access is that we want all students to have access to a strong core. We want them to have instruction. We want them to be in their general education setting with access to grade level peers. Because when students have and are making connections with their teachers and with their peers, they feel included and they are going to grow socially and emotionally. And also they are going to meet their learning goals as well. The next lever that we align with is the health and well-being lever. So we have the student support form that is on the Des Moines Public School webpage. And we have members of the integrated services team that meet weekly to discuss that student support form that can be filled out by family members. It can be filled out by teachers. And they really get together once a week to problem solve barriers so that they are able to provide supports to students and families in a timely manner so that we can make sure that students and families are being supported. We also are aligning with our safety lever, and we have a safety plan that includes a positive and supportive plan for all students so that we can protect their social and emotional needs. So part of the work that we have been doing is really working towards getting to our national recommended ratio. This is probably not new information to you. You've seen it before. In what we would expect to see or what we want to see in schools. We'd want to see one counselor to 250 students, one social worker to 400, one psychologist to 600 students, and to have one community schools coordinator per school. And on this next slide, you can see where we are this year and where we are headed for next year. So we have been able to add additional support staff in order to start moving toward the ratios. So in terms of future staffing, what you'll notice is that we are pretty close in getting to the national ratio for counselors. And so right now, our focus with counselors, we're going to continue to recruit, but we're also going to focus very heavily on retaining really good counselors so that they can help support in the schools and continue to move this work forward. We're also continuing to recruit social workers and adding positions every year. We're making sure that we're aligning their work within integrated services and providing them with a lot of adult learning. A lot of the new social workers who come to us have not been in a school setting before. And so we spend a lot of time providing trainings so that they know how to support students in a school because it's a little bit different. Their client is a little bit different. And I remember that is something that Laura would always talk about is the client is really the teacher because we're helping teachers so that they can support the students in the classroom. Also with psychologists, we know that there is a nationwide shortage of school psychologists, and we have been going to the NASP conference every year, the national conference to recruit, and we've had some really good luck getting psychs. We are also with integrated services are following the NASP model of how to practice school psychology. And so we're continuing to work on ways to be really attractive to new school psychs so that they are coming into a system that supports their needs as professionals and what they've been trained to do. So one of the things we're really focusing on is figuring out what is it that a school psychologist only a school psychologist can do based on their current licensure, and take some things off their plate that isn't necessarily specific to a school psychologist that other members of that team can possibly do. So we're working on coming up with some creative and alternative solutions, because we know it will be a long time, if ever, that we can get to the national ratio for school psychologists. And then for community schools coordinators, we're continuing to secure funding and alignment of like positions. And we're working on continuing to add community schools coordinators every year. And I'm going to hand it off to Jake. Or Dow.
Yeah,
Hey,
Dr. Jock will take over for me.
Hey, good evening, Madam Chair, Board, Dr. Ahart, community out there, and staff as well. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think to continue on that, we'd like to highlight 3 areas here that we'll spend some time updating you all on, namely a professional development plan, the curriculum aspect of it, and then the assessment tool. But I think to do the work justice, it's also contextualize it, right, as we go forward. So I want to take a minute here, Madam Chair and the board, and just ask this question, if you could please reflect on it, maybe write a couple of notes on it, which is, what are your hopes and dreams for students, staff, and communities of DMPS? I would also ask all staff and maybe community out there, if you could please just think about that question for a second here. So I invite you, maybe at some point you can socialize with each other, especially the board members offline. Greatly appreciate that. This is important because as we go, it will flow together. You'll see the relevance to it. Jake, next slide, please. I wanted to ask that we watch this video. It's by Dr. Rob Jagers, who is a VP of Castle, heavily researched on equity. Right? When you talk about the pandemic exacerbating the inequities that exist, especially in K-12, he's at the forefront of how do we ensure that SEL is equitable, and what are we really trying to do with SEL to begin with, right? What is our objective? So I just want to share, ask that we watch this video real quick before we move on. Thank you, Jake.
Yep, just a thumbs up that you can hear it when I get it rolling.
I think it will take optimal development of all of our young people in order for us, collectively to face the challenges that seem to loom on the horizon. Really, it's about preparing the next generation of informed and engaged citizens. Right now, we have an untapped pool of talent. And so the idea is to leverage SEL in order to help young people realize those talents and thereby help the broader society and, in fact, the world. SEL is really about the holistic development of young people. If you think about all spaces as places where people learn, both young people and adults, then we can think about schools and classrooms, out of school time spaces, families, etc., as places where there's an exchange of knowledge. All of those kinds of experiences, I think, help shape the ways in which young people understand themselves and other people. Learning itself is a relational process. The more we can do to facilitate the adults and the students learning about themselves and learning about one another and learning about the world around them, I think we're better served, we're more comprehensive, we're more integrative, and subsequently we would expect better outcomes for adults and students. Teachers position themselves not as keepers of knowledge and disseminators of knowledge, but as co-learners, co-constructors of knowledge. Any one person does not occur in a vacuum, does not experience life in a vacuum. And so how do you create internal workings and external contexts that allow you to be the best person that you could possibly be. And for us to do that collectively, I think then allows for us to have neighborhoods and cities and suburbs that function better and thereby, allow us to be as productive and happy as possible.
Thank you, sir. So, team, Chairman, Madam Chair, and board, this is key here because these are some of the words when we ask our leaders from admin to the top leadership of the district, what are your goals and dreams for our students, staff, communities? And these are some of the things that come up, right? In particular, this sense of belonging. And so transformative SEO is how we're approaching it. And it's this idea that young people and adults can build strong, respectful, and lasting relationships that can facilitate co-learning that critically examines root causes of inequities, right? And to be able to develop collaborative solutions, whether it be in the personal, community, and also societal well-being. This is important because when we talk about equity, when we talk about becoming anti-racism, or become an anti-racist system, what that means is we have to lift the identity of every individual in our district, every student, every staff, every family. And by so doing, we allow them to exist, to experience the humanity. And that calls on us to do something more than just the traditional social emotional learning. That calls on us to interrogate deeply, not only the way we do things, but how we show up as individuals, how we live with one another, how we lead, right? And not only that, but how we celebrate. And so this is key because identity, agency, and belonging is a thing. This past weekend, we had so many graduates from DMPS, right? And those graduates, they ought to go out in the world with a self-awareness that allows them to compete in a global market, with a sense of identity and agency and belonging that allows them to compete and also be part of any community they go to. That's absolutely critical. And so we ought to be able to talk about tough conversations about identity, race, gender, class, because this is part of us when we talk about intersectionality. And DMPS is a diverse community. And so what we do, we have to be transformative in that. So here's our vision for what SEO ought to do. So bottom line up front is we ought to become the model educational equity and excellence in America. And how we do that is we create space for students to achieve their academic and life goals, right? Develop healthy and positive relationships with their peers, with adults, right? And also skills to be responsible citizens, right? Go out in the world and thrive. As for our staff, it's cultivating safe, equitable, and thriving work environment, one where people want to come and work in Des Moines public schools, one that people want to stay here and they want to invest and they want their kids to go to our school district, but also a community that advances, authentic relationships and authentic partnerships through trust, collaborative relationships, and meaningful conversations, right? One where we can have a shared understanding of our common humanity. That's how we envision SEO playing a role in DMPS. Now, how does that come into play? How do we operationalize that? So the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning is the gold standard in the field since '94 when it was created. And one of those founding members was Daniel Goleman, who is one of the top experts on emotional intelligence. And how we're using the Ed Castle framework with the five competencies is these are critical skills that individuals in our district ought to have, not only for their personal life, but also within our districts, be it adults, but also students. Because, for example, self-awareness, being able to connect your values, your thoughts, as well as your emotions, right? That's not a skill that innately we know, or it just come inherently to everyone. It's one that has to be nurtured, but in an equitable space, because this work can absolutely be weaponized. But more importantly, part of that is the authentic partnerships. If you advance next slide, please, Jake. The authentic partnerships, right? the community, the family, that context matters, right? That matters because a student, when they show up in our district, they're not a singular identity. They come with unique lived experiences, lived identities, and those matter to us in our district. And so how do we lift the lived experience of every student? In order to do that, we need those competencies, we need those skills to be able to have that and facilitate an equitable learning environment, but also authentic relationships based on respect, agency, and belonging. Next slide, please, sir. So this, how are we going to about this, right? Briefing by exception, this semester alone, we facilitated 60 professional learning experiences for over 940 district staff and school admin. And so the focus was on a learning experience to have a shared language, but more importantly, allowing adults to experience what are they feeling, right? What are they feeling? Because we expect so much from them, especially from the pandemic, and we want them to do right by students. But if we just stop for a moment, what are they feeling, right? How are you wrestling with the burnout, with the stress, all of that? And so allowing space to do that while we have shared language, so that when we go in front of students, we are authentically ourselves. That's important, because if we're not authentically ourselves, we're cheating the students. And so that's what we did this semester. 71% of those who responded to a survey after the session, felt they met fully their learning target, which is the self-examination, right? And 27% said they partially met, right? And so part of that, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, part of this is there's some unlearning and relearning that we have to do, because transformative SEL, and with partnership with Castle, we're in conversation with them every 2 weeks. And one of the things that's being lifted is there's few districts that have done this successfully or are doing this successfully. And so this allows us to tackle equity head on using social emotional learning, right? And so that's key for us. We're going to continue to do this. So next year we'll do K-12, right? And we're going to continue to address professional learning, make it differentiated so that we have shared language, but also build that skill set at a higher level. Next slide, please, Jake. So I'll send over to Jake.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good evening, board, Madam Chair, and Dr. Ahart. We've worked extensively on putting together a phase plan of implementation for SEL. We provided the draft for your viewing needs there in the report as well. One of the many things that we considered throughout the development of that, through multiple collaborations, was just the mission and vision of the district and what direction we're headed, the work and the priorities that we have. Really honed in on the requirements to meet Board Limitation 2.10. We did really use the anti-racism and equity work that we've been doing, but also through those town halls and multiple conversations, meetings that we continue to have to help guide that plan. Foundational principles for SEL, which we'll review here in a few slides, but those were really the foundational ways that we laid out the phase plan. When we review those, you'll see that it asks us to consider to do implementation differently and non-traditionally compared to how we've done implementation in the past. We've looked at the Castle 5 competencies and the partnership that we have with them. As Dow mentioned, we have a formal technical assistance partnership with them that we meet bi-weekly, and then we have continued meetings and planning with them as we begin to strategize and implement our phase plan. Also, we have a great relationship with the Iowa Department of Education, specifically their lead for SEL. We've looked at the Iowa SEL competencies and learning targets and have adopted those as our foundational learning targets for our students as we move out for implementation. We have spent a lot of time with stakeholder groups vetting the implementation plan, the phase plan. We have really landed on 3 phases of implementation, and we're using the term phasing very specifically as it's not an adoption, it's not time bound, it's standard based or competency based. So when school sites specifically meet standard or target, then you accomplish successfully that phase and move on to the next phase of implementation. That's really important, as we're really looking for, as Dal has mentioned and walked us through, is that transformational change as we go through implementation. In phase 1, you'll see that really what's highlighted is the plan and organize and align systems at the local level to ensure successful implementation of SEL. Phase 2, we're really looking at adopting resources and thinking about strategically integrating those into policies, practices, and academics. And by Phase 3, looking at ways to continuously improve and sustain the work. If I can point out specifically, what you'll see here is really, I guess what we'll point out is when folks think about implementation, specifically in the traditional fashion around education, we think about curriculum implementation. Really, curriculum implementation isn't considered towards the end of Phase 2 of this plan. So just to be very explicit, Phase 1 is really important that we not only get staff, students, and the community at large, working together and organizing, that we look at making that transformational change before we look at implementing curriculum holistically in our buildings. So key elements that we see per phase, that just to talk over the plan that you may have previewed, is really there's a time frame that's suggested per phase that would be kind of giving buildings and staff an idea of what would be an expected commitment per phase. Stakeholder expectations, and you may see that we listed as many stakeholders as possible to be very specific and explicit about what we would expect stakeholder participation to look like. We outlined key actions that need to be completed. We also did phase completions, or what the standard would be. Dow will go into that here in a little bit regarding some of the perspective-based survey data that will be used as one of the markers of success towards meeting that phase. We had many considerations that would be applicable in each phase, and then lastly, kind of the anticipated challenges that we expect at the school site. So this is kind of harkening back to those foundational SEL principles as why did we choose a phase plan? SEL, as it's said here in the founding principle, is an ongoing process. And we're talking about something that's continuously improving, that really doesn't have an end. In terms of when would I be done with my own SEL improvement, is something that we continue to work on. So there harkens the phase plan. SEL learning involves adults as teachers and lifelong learners, meaning that we are prioritizing adults because they are the modeling of the behaviors and skill set that we want to project and be a part of that community with students. We don't want adults to also be explicitly teaching skills and things that they haven't modeled or adopted themselves. Also, SEL helps create that safe space, healthy and supportive environment that we're looking to cultivate and build upon as we move throughout. And it's human work. It's not time-bound work. Dr. Jock was going to kind of walk us through our most recent assessment.
Yeah, and Jake, if I may lift something, Madam Chair, Board, and Dr. Ehart, to add to what Jake was talking about, one of the things is, when we talk about emotional contagion, in emotion science, the idea that moods can transfer from one person to another, or from individuals to groups. That's why it's even more essential to get at adult SEL, because their moods and their emotions absolutely transfer to others. And as you all can attest to, you've been in spaces where that's true. And so emotion science, that's the case. Also, another consideration, as Mr. Troja was talking about, is building school capacity for sustainability, because part of the Celeria that Allison mentioned earlier is one of their feedbacks with initiative fatigue. And so what we need to do is build capacity at each building so that all our students are getting quality SEL across the board, right? And it's not dependent necessarily on singular individuals, but it's a system-wide effort. So I want to touch on the Panorama perspective-based data on some of the things you see in the blue, some of the areas that we measure on, and a couple of areas that I would like to focus on tonight. Next slide, Jake, please. So the first thing is, in the fall, we had the Panorama survey, and we saw some things that were good and some things that made us curious, right? We saw increases across many areas. So i.e. climate and culture, that was a big jump, as you can see, from 58 in the spring to 70%. For secondary, it was an 11 percentage points jump. So we wanted to look at why was that the case, or what might be some of the underlying causations. So Dr. Grinstead's team, in particular, Josie Sturgis, looked into, led the focus groups. So the idea was the three areas where we saw some differences were teacher-student relationships, school climate, and a sense of belonging, right? Do students feel like they belong? And so for that, what she did was the schools that had positive change, she had 5 schools, 2 middle and 2 elementary, and then 1 high school. And then schools that saw no change, 3, and then also 3 for the ones that where had negative loss there. So next couple of slides, we'll kind of talk about, you know, some of the analysis and some of the interesting conclusions that came out of that, right? So the first one is quite interesting, actually. So the recent return to school, to in-person learning or hybrid, a lot of students saw that was a plus, right? Because engagement with other students, so they missed the relationship with one another. And so that was something that came out of that focus group, right? Where students highlighted that, but also staff. And so they were excited to return to in-person, whether it be fully or hybrid. That's one thing there. And off note here, between the virtual and in-person, there are some things we can look at qualitatively that the students lifted. One of them from virtual is it was harder to convey energy, right, virtually. But in person, they were glad to be back. Again, the human relationships, that was something that was key there. And then appreciation for casual interactions. But then the second piece here, the foundational relationship building in virtual environment is key. Because on the other hand, some of the feedback was that in virtual, students had direct check-ins, right, from teachers and school staff. That was a key for students because it made a difference for them. And they felt like that was consequential and good. But also that staff discussed the value of flexibility with virtual schedule, right? Again, that was a factor in that. And then that site-specific characteristics is another one, because obviously the uniqueness of each building and in school presents its own challenges and things like that. Next slide, please, Jake. So considerations to note here, teachers noted that, you know, they had permission to put kids first, right? That is something that came up, and from the SEL lens for us is, again, that sense of belonging, that permission to feel, permission to be, permission to humanize. And that's something we're gonna continue to underscore there as well. And so again, staff noted connection between staff and students' well-being. This is key, goes back to the adult SEL. This underscores again, right? So staff, they saw the connection between their own health and well-being and the students. So for us, that means that we have to account for the adult SEL piece. Because if we don't do that and miss that, that's going to be consequential down the road, and it's going to cost us. So in order to create equitable learning experiences in each classroom, we also need to create equitable working environments for each staff member to bring out their best as well. And then obviously the virtual setting neutralize distracting behaviors. So that's in the fall. So for this spring, we saw a little bit of increase in participation, which again is a huge credit to not only the leadership, but also the teachers at each building, because the many challenges, as you all are aware, not only last semester, but this semester, yet they were able to get high participation rate for staff and then also for students. Next slide, please, Jake. So here we saw a little bit of a slight dip in climate and culture and student relationship, teacher relationships. I would like to draw your attention to, over the years, Dr. Ahero was sort of talking about it earlier. What the trend that we're seeing now is that in the fall, it's a little bit higher than spring. However, from year to year, it's an increase, right? And that's substantial because it means that our leaders and teachers are doing the right things in the classrooms, and we're going to support them to continue in that way, and also support their efforts and amplify areas where we're doing really well. The one we'd like to underscore here also is self-efficacy, because this is consequential, right? This is students' capacity and confidence in their capacity to do the work, right? And be able to remember and understand. And so we saw an increase in that of both elementary and secondary. that's a point of celebration. Again, we did not do a focus group for this spring. However, if we were to say what is the reason, I think part of it is efforts, consistency across the board, where you see communication and a lot of staff covering a lot of ground with our students as well. And again, families also to be commended in that, because they have been called to do their part as well. Next slide, please, Jake. Here, of interest, Madam Chair and Board and Dr. Ahart, I'd like to point your attention for staff. This is important because, again, if we're going to create an equitable learning experience for students, we need to also focus on what's going on with our staff, right? And so for teachers, school climate, it was a little bit down, but again, from year to year, from this school year, it was way 11 percentage points more than last year, which is key. And that can be attributed to many factors, not the least of which is also efforts being made across the board. Teacher self-reflection. And so that one is the perceptions of their professional strength in areas of growth related to social emotional learning. And so there's some areas where, you know, a lot of teachers were confident in, and areas that will need to improve. And so we have identified that. We're going to act on that, right? And how can we support, again, the good things that are happening in the buildings? And then educating all students. Again, that's confidence. And that's also related not only to special education and what's happening there, also with our equity work. And so how can we support our staff in that capacity? And so we'll continue to move forward by trying to understand what's happening, where are the gaps, and so that we can address them as well. Because the last thing we want a picture, open book, so that we can look ourselves in the mirror clearly, so that we can address what we're coming up short, but also celebrate areas where there are areas of growth and opportunities for growth there as well. Last slide here, again, comes back to, you know, two things that we've talked about before, but are absolutely essential, right? And that first one there is to draw your attention to student self-efficacy. Because if students believe they have the confidence to do it, and the climate is set, the student outcomes will improve. And that's based on research, right? So what are we doing in our capacity to ensure that we're improving the competencies for adults to model, but also we're creating the conditions for equitable learning experience for students. And then last one right there is the student-teacher relationships, right? Going back to what the community asks of us. And then also, more importantly, these three areas of not only climate and culture, student-teacher relationship, but self-efficacy speak directly to how are we supporting our graduates so that they have the skills and the capacity to go and thrive post-secondary. And that's key for us as well. So I'll give it back to Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Dow. Just want to remind a couple things for the board that the data that we've collected so far, is using as a baseline data, not only specifically for implementation, and every building has data that's specific to their community. And so we'll be using that data to really help us guide improvement and measure improvement at that local level. So we should continue to see improvement in those numbers as we implement starting next year. So a few items I note before we close out and open up for questions. As Dr. Ahart had already mentioned, Dow has been accepted as a fellow within the CASCO work, and that's a really extreme privilege for us. Very few candidates selected nationally, and so Dow will be able to be a liaison for really what we would consider to be a national and worldwide expertise into the field of SEL. We have formalized our CASCO technical assistance. We've talked about that a couple times tonight, but that's a continuous partnership that we'll have with CASCO as we continue to implement. They provided lots of feedback, strategy with us as we begin to implement, and we'll continue to do that. I just want to underscore that even further just by looking at the research and the qualitative and quantitative data they have that helps support the plan as we move forward. They're looking at the 10 to 12 districts that have really been working at this for a number of years. There's several districts that Dow and I and Allie have been connected with that would be considered leading in the nation around SEL implementation. So that's been very helpful for us to connect with those districts through this formalized process. And lastly, we been securing a research partnership with a national organization for SEL adult curriculum. We have been in talks with a few organizations, but several of note. We're hoping to formally announce that here shortly, where we'll be getting access not only to adult curriculum in terms of resources and things that we can use that schools can implement with, but also the research behind whether or not that implementation has been successful. And so that will be some technical assistance, that'll be some qualitative analysis that we'll be partnering with, hopefully with a national organization here soon. That will just be a huge boost, not only for at the local level when we start to measure successful implementation, but just for our district as a whole to see what implementation looks like and how we know that we're being successful, specifically during phase 1. So that is critical to our moment as we move forward. That is our presentation for this evening, and we'll just pause here. Dr. Hare, if you'd like to add anything else, but we'll answer any questions the board has.
Jake, if you could, I think it's slide 24, if you would bring that slide up. I meant to comment on this and it got away from me. Just to help, yeah. Phase 1 is so important. I sort of referenced it in my introductory comments, but each sub-organization, each school needs to have a plan that is an actual plan that is organized and aligned with their already existing systems, or to modify existing systems so that as we go deeper with this work, it's sustainable. So you might think about adopting a new class. If you adopt a new class on, say, Latinx studies, and you don't have anyone who can teach it, that's all well and good that you adopted the new class, but if there's nobody qualified to teach it, it really doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't become integrated into the system. And since we haven't done, we haven't done, system-wide aligned SEL work prior to, really initiating this work a few months before the board passed this policy, 6 months before the board passed this policy. The space doesn't necessarily exist in each of the organizations at the building level to ensure that the work actually happens and that it's done well and that there's a plan to not only go deeper with it but to sustain it. And so while the phasing feels a bit foreign as opposed to a rollout of a new curriculum and having time limited steps in the process, this really is how it has to happen for us to really do it in a transformative fashion. So I just wanted to double down on that phasing of the implementation to make sure that there's that understanding that if we are truly committed to this, we do have to do significant changes to the system to ensure that we do have the ongoing capacity to actually do it well.
If I may, Dr. Ahart, to also add to that, so with curriculum, I know Jake talked about it earlier. Curriculum is one component, right? And as is right now, one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, how does it service DMPS, right? So we don't care about which vendor or what's going on. We do care about is how does it meet our needs, right? So through that lens, that's how we're looking at curriculum as one component. The other component that is critical is infusing SEL into academics so that when you go to every classroom, eventually you can see signs of SEL or what that looks like, right? That's the goal. And then every adult in the building or that interacts with students is able to see and model for our students. Last thing with the professional learning is this has covered everyone from transportation to facilities, right? We've had the great privilege of spending 2 Wednesday mornings with facilities out at the Dean Building doing SEL, right? And it may seem like a foreign concept to some to talk about emotions, especially, in our society, we have certain notions about it. But it was so beautiful to see their humanity come forward and the comfort level, right? And so what that, again, is every adult in our district contributes to student outcomes, indirectly or directly. And so celebrating that and going on that is absolutely essential because we're able to affirm each individual within the system. Thank you.
Before we get started with questions, I first want to thank Dow. I want to thank you, Jake, and welcome, Allison. I want to thank you for your presentation this evening and updating the board at where we're at as a district with our SEL work. Before we get into questions, I would like to ask for a motion. May I have a motion and a second to accept the presentation and supplemental documents as providing evidence for compliance with a reasonable interpretation of management limitation 2.10. And after the motion and seconds made, then I will open it up for questions.
Martirano, so moved.
Della Gardell, I'll second the motion, but I have a question. And this is probably just more of a technicality. I think it's listed for the public as just a presentation and not as action being taken. Does that impact our ability to vote tonight?
Oh, thanks for raising that. I'm just looking at my script, so not for that. Is it Ms. Della Gardell, did you say it's just listed as no action taken?
It's just listed as the type is listed as presentation. It's not listed like as an action item. So I just didn't know if that impacts our ability to be able to vote.
I don't know that it does. It is under, I believe, board reports for that. So I believe that we will be all right in taking action in this. I know that we put up our new agenda and flow of things. So I will make sure to look at that in future to make sure that we let you know and the public know if we're going to be taking action on an item.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm confident voting to accept it or not. I just wanted to make sure we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. So
no, I thank you. I appreciate it, Ms. Della Gardell. So I have a motion.
I'll second
by Ms. Okay, thank you. I have a motion by Ms. Martirano and a second by Ms. Della Gardell. Now I will open up for any discussion or questions from my board colleagues.
Yeah, I do have one, and this is regarding the data that you showed. Do you guys have any inkling of why the numbers are so much higher at the elementary level compared to the 6 through 12?
Yeah.
Well, I'll let Dow and others weigh in on that. That's certainly a trend that is common nationally. I think there's probably a number of factors. I think one of those is just organically at the elementary level. You tend to have closer bonds between teacher and students because the students, tend to sort of be that same group of students is together most of the day with the same adult or adults most of the day. And then, age is also another factor in that. So those are two of the largest reasons, but Jake or Allison or Dow, do you have other thoughts to add?
I can add to that. Yeah, I think the research would say several things. One is about 6th grade is that where it taps out, 6th and 7th grade, where students care most about what their teacher thinks. At that point in time and beyond that, it starts to become peers take over about midway through 7th grade up through high school. So that is a part of that. Secondly, what the research would prove is that students become, away from the unconscious system that they're in, they become conscious of that system, and that's part of that detachment from the work, which is also, I think, an extreme reason why we focus in on adults and also the people within that system to ensure that it's equitable and reasonable. And they also become socially more aware, so less aware to aware throughout that process as well. Those are multiple reasons. In addition, the last thing I would add, and then I can let Allie and Dow, back that up, or anything else that you'd like to add. The research would talk about students' attendance. As they become older, they have the more independence to really vote with their feet, which again harkens us to build quality climates for students to be engaged in as they get older. So those all things bear out an effect on those data numbers as well.
I concur, Jake. One thing I would add to it too is, emotionally, the developmental element of it, as Dr. Ahart mentioned, having the same teachers and consistency creates a certain level of safety with the adults. But then when you go to secondary, you have different subject areas, different exposure. And so the emotional element of it, the socialization, there are inherently different challenges. And so when we're looking at that, that's one where when at secondary level, student agency and student voice becomes one of our key tenets that we're going to need to tackle. Because if students feel like they have agency and belonging, they're more likely to improve in these areas versus the elementary. It's a little bit more what the adult thinks.
So would you guys say that it's kind of fair to not look at those as two kind of competing, or it's not really fair to compare them against each other? We're just looking at growth overall for each cohort.
Yep, absolutely. Because if I may, Jake, so great question, Mr. Cody. So for elementary, in terms of percentage nationally, we do relatively okay. For the most of them, close to 50 percentile or more, roughly. But self-efficacy, for example, our secondary level is at below 10th percentile across nationally. And so it's not a fair comparison, but it's also, as Dr. Ahart mentioned, nationally, when we talk to Panorama, it is consistent with what they're getting as well. And we're able to compare ourselves to other districts, urban districts with the same criteria as us. And for the most part, elementary does relatively well compared to secondary as well.
Now, just add in the data report that we provided, you should see the percentile ranking, and that is relative to the setting. So 612 or secondary schools are compared to each other nationally.
Thank you.
So I have a few questions. Going back to, you showed one slide that talked about you had completed about 60 trainings with staff, about 940 staff members. So that appears to me be about 18% of our staff population. What is the long-term plan to train staff, and what is the ongoing expectation of professional development? Because I am not a fan of one-and-dones. And so what is your progress and what is the plan to make sure that this learning is really being integrated with staff? And then how are you going to monitor this with staff, that they are truly using these practices within their classroom, with their kids? So what's the plan?
Yes, ma'am. So I will start by this. So we started with the district level. So the staff that were trained mainly at the district level. And so for both the district and schools, we have a scope and sequence of how we want to do it. And so we have to synchronize it so it's continuous. At the district level, what we did this semester was provide 2 foundational sessions and then have deep dives. So those deep dives go into explicitly specific topics. So i.e. Self-awareness. What does that mean? How does that play out? Or social awareness. How does that relate to equity, right? And so we're going to continue to do that. The expectation at the district level is departments will continue to engage in ongoing professional development. And we're going to sequence it out to where we bring in cultural competencies. We bring in other areas, equity, and touch on that. We're going to have self-assessment as well, that in which the self-perspective-based data of adults looking at where do they think they're weak at or strong at relative to the 5 CASEL competencies. At the building level, next year, we're doing K-12. Everybody's going to do foundational SEL. And then the whole idea is initially the district will provide the PD, but then we want to build the capacity at the building level where we provide a shell of a scope and sequence, but then that school team is able to pick it up and then take it so that the building owns that professional development. And then our job becomes redeploying resources and support. The C3s will be able to provide support and coaching. And so what we want to do is turn it from the district-led to building-led, and then we provide support. But it's going to be continuous and ongoing throughout all the phases. Last thing I would like to note there is, how do we know? Well, part of it is we're going to have looking at the Panorama perspective-based data. And that's where we added slide 34 with the staff panorama. What does that look like? Because we need to be accountable to that as well. The second thing is, although it's self-perspective based and we don't want to necessarily act on, but how do staff see themselves? So if self-awareness, and this is the difficulty, if self-awareness improves, your scores might actually go down relative to the self-assessment. And so that might be counterintuitive, but that's what we want to do, is improve that self-awareness, social awareness, and different things. So that becomes tricky, right? How do we measure that to a way? Because it's how, not necessarily what, and how are they, what are they improving on? So, because again, it's subjective, it's individual, has to change, but we're going to provide the space, the learning experience in order to be able to do that.
And will that learning be required and not just a voluntary that
Yes.
staff can choose to come in and out of?
Yes, ma'am. It will be required. So this semester, all the sessions were required. We communicated with the heads of the department. So Jake and his team, they did it, right? Every department head had to do it. And if they didn't, they got a lot of emails from our team. And so that is going to be a requirement. That is not an option.
Okay, another question I have. So it took me a while to kind of grasp between SEL, mental health, and primarily because I encompass mental health as being holistic health and well-being. And, the one thing that you had mentioned is that Laura's comment that the client is the teacher. And so I'm continually thinking about our students. And what we know from Houston, or at least what happened with the Houston School District after Hurricane Katrina, and the increase in mental health diagnoses with our kids in that school setting, how are we planning for our kids coming out of this pandemic? And I say this with the context of having spoken to somebody in juvenile courts, and their number one, if they could have a wish list of how to spend some of our federal dollars, it is making sure that we have mental health supports for kids in schools. And like nothing in here do I hear how we're going to address the mental health needs of our kids, especially when some of that may not really be seen until sometime into next year. And so while this is maybe a little bit different than SEL, but I am interested to see what the plan is from a district perspective to talk about the mental health needs of our kids, especially since we have an influx of, we got federal funds coming in. We also have some additional ARPA dollars coming in. So are there plans that are being discussed to address that?
Yeah, Kelly, I'll just take that one. That's really kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. We do have, we actually have a number of things that I think are relevant to that. We're anticipating an influx also of potentially strong potential of an influx of more immigrant students as well, which is going to impact that. So while they're closely associated, this group's role certainly wasn't to specifically address mental health needs. I will say though, and Allison referenced this earlier in the conversation, that we've been collecting data from families, individual students and families through the year, and that data is looked at on a weekly basis, at least a weekly basis, to ensure that we're matching supports with students, and we'll continue to be responsive to that. So, we certainly will have dollars available to respond to what that data may show us is an increased need in a particular area, or more access to services, et cetera, based on what we learn from our families and from our students.
Just really quick, a final question. I know you guys talked about the student supports or the forms that come in. Like, what are you guys seeing with the highest level of need for families? Or I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I can talk about that quickly. We plan on preparing the information for the board for August for our treatment students report, but I can, if you could give me a few minutes, I could probably answer that question more specifically. I have the information. I think our community schools team really has been the lead of that, and Allison Vukovic and Kara and her team have been really kind of leading through that student supports forum. I think back to Tom's comment specifically, you know, we were looking at next year, and one of the levers that we talked about was access, and that student supports forum will be the way that we will refer students to support. And as you know, that's been on the website since the beginning of the school year. So I have some data relative to that I could respond to, but we were really including that in our treatment and students report, which I think again goes back to maybe combining some of the pieces that cross over around that. But if you would like a response, then I could get that here shortly.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Jake.
I'd be happy to email you some of those numbers if that's something that you would want to see as well.
So this is Terry, and I had a couple of things. I think that Kelly's comments really reflect back for me some of the redundancy that I think we're going to have to sort out when it comes to our treatment of students report and how then we monitor back to SEL. And if there's a way that those could somehow be merged or combined, or if there's a place where we can sort of hit a sweet spot where the information from one sort of supports the information from the other, I think that might be something that we may want to sort out and think about. So I just lift that up as something that we probably need to be much more attentive to at the board level. I do have a question about the data. And you talked, Dow, about the work that was being done with non-teaching staff and how operations and others are being engaged in this work. Are we in any way differentiating the data that we're seeing in each of those groups so that we can get a better sense of where we may need to either drill down, be more intentional, or more focused around training? Because I would imagine that the teachers and the people who are actually physically in the building working with students have a greater affinity and alignment with this work that doesn't necessarily always extend to bus drivers and other operations staff. So I'm just wondering if we're differentiating how we are looking at that data so that we can be much more specific about interventions that may or may not be required.
Yeah, I'd love to take a stab at that and then pass it to Dr. Jock. A couple things that you bring up a really good point in and you danced around a couple of really good things, Terry. And I think one of them specifically, I want to address the way that you talked to the board about the limitations. It does, when it talks about integrated services and staff complement, those two first limitations kind of are very broad, which really lead to like treatment of students and staff. So those are the two that to me kind of help make things a little bit muddy. 3 through 6 are very clear. That's very specific to SEL. So that's how we kind of try to interpret the limitation that makes sense of it for everybody. To respond to your question, we do use the Gallup scores, the Q12, and we did not include that in this measure here specifically. It's also included in the treatment of staff report. But that one specifically is for all staff, and the Panorama survey that we have is really for staff within schools that are assigned to a school. So it's differentiated that way. We have used that data to inform the decision making around the phase plan, but we did not present it here as part of that. We could in the future if that was something that would be meaningful. To answer your question, yes, we can differentiate the data out, and we can provide specifically some delineation between roles and responsibilities within the building at Panorama as well. Some interesting things and trends that we've noticed is around how administrators respond versus teaching staff, how associates respond versus teaching staff, and looking about their perspectives of the environment and climate, and how that we can, through our work, help mitigate and bring those perspectives closer with an alignment. So those are ways that we can do that, but the short answer is, yeah, absolutely, we can see that. We also look at the district-wide Gallup specific data, which I'm sure Dr. Ahart can speak to. But Dow, feel free to add anything you'd like to that conversation.
Yep, and the second part of that, Ms. Garland Johnson, is the differentiated PD necessary. So at the building level, we are going to do differentiated PD, especially relative to the competencies, which are the ones that they're going to teach young people right? As part of the curriculum piece. At the district level is more the emotional intelligence. How do we function as members of teams? How do we use these skills to improve our capacity to communicate, problem solve, and other things? So that will continue to be the case. And as Jake mentioned, at the district level or non-teaching staff, the Gallup will be our primary, as well as the self-assessments. And then also based on the department or the group, the team, that will be another element to it. But at the building level, we are absolutely going to differentiate. One of the key elements that we'll come back to on the board is the slide I shared about the staff panorama data. That is for the building staff. And so that's one we're going to continue to monitor because it speaks to the necessity to address some of those things.
I just had one other quick question, and that really goes to our financial investment in this work. And going back to the early slides where we talk about sort of the sweet spot for ratio and what it should look like. You know, at some point, we're going to get to a point where there are going to be so many competing demands that our ability to sort of get to that sweet spot for staff-student ratios across each of those, I think, 4 areas will be maybe challenged or even compromised. So can you speak just a little bit about sustainability of effort and fidelity to initiative, even when we're not able to get to those ratios that you've identified?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. Dr. Ahart, if you wouldn't mind to talk about our plan. I think this
Sure.
limitation, yeah, thank you, appreciate that. This limitation specifically has challenged us when it talks about full integration of learning supports and staff complement to really narrow that down to what do we mean specifically. And I think that has challenged us to look at how we use dollars specifically to ensure that we are able to make the staffing ratios that we know research suggests leads us to the goal we want to be at. One of those decisions we crossed was about a year ago was when we looked at the removal of Scavo High School, and we're excited, to talk about some of the impacts that we're able to make because of those staffing challenges and changes that we did at that time. That was a difficult decision based on just the historical nature of that school. But what you'll see hopefully coming up in August when we talk about student report is just the impact we've been able to have by taking those resources. And that's really how we got to close to that national ratio in school counselors. We were able to expand programming there specifically. We're being really creative in our integrated services work around blending funding, looking at other options to gather funding. We're also narrowing down what options we have available for staffing to ensure that we have a systematic approach for preparing, onboarding, and supporting those staff members as they move forward. So we're optimistically positive about how we can reach those ratios because we're being very specific and tailoring our allocations to those areas specifically. We've been creative and worked really well with Dr. Grinstead's team around the use of Title IV dollars. We're really starting to look at the use of Title I dollars and see how we can make sure that those are in alignment of the full-fledged plan. So cautiously optimistic that we're able to get to those ratios. Again, we'll talk about some of those things in August around the treatment of students. We reallocated the $750,000 from SROs to help us get to ratio in some of those positions at the high school level as well. So we're kind of looking at all things to make sure that we're in alignment and using the tools that we know gives the best chance at reaching the goals that the community is asking us to do.
Yeah, I would just add to that I agree with everything that Mr. Troja just shared. I would also add that as we go through this work, the board has clearly identified SEL as a priority, and if the work is happening and we're seeing progress, schools will help us shape what that funding allocation needs to look like, because if they're getting value from these positions, and like Jake said, we're being much more specific, I guess, and disciplined about what's expected from each of these roles. And so if they're working, the buildings will be helping us make those tough decisions about where to invest those dollars, knowing that we need to be making progress on our 3 SMART goals and SEL as we move forward. So there have been some tough decisions, but I think the right decisions here in the last couple of years relative to funding these positions. But I also think that we've aligned these very cleanly so that we can justify that shift in investment. But it will continue to be definitely a balancing act as we move forward in light of what we anticipate from our typical funding sources. And of course, with our community and schools, we continue to pursue mostly federal grants and some local dollars to support getting to the recommended staffing ratio in that area.
Yeah, I really appreciate the notion of trade-offs and prioritization, and I think it's as much for you at the staff level to think about it as it is for we at the board table to also consider that as we continue to move forward. You got to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to fund your priorities. And so I think we also have to have a level of understanding, especially when we get pushback from the community and other folks around the things that matter to them that may or may not specifically align with our priorities. I think we're just going to have to have the fortitude, if you will, to stay the course. So thank you.
I have a combination observation and question regarding this work. We've talked a lot about adults, and at the very start of the session, you asked us to take a moment and think about what our goal is for students. And you reported out that you asked the staff that same question. Again, an adult question reported back that belonging was one of the top items. I know that we are surveying our students, but I'm wondering where the student voice comes in, and if we are truly getting a picture of our entire student body regarding student needs. If we are trying to identify those student needs based on what adults believe a student needs, I worry about the biases that come into play around how a student best learns, or what a student may or may not need based on the implicit bias that already exists. So I guess I have questions around how are we truly getting that student voice, and are we having conversations at the adult tables around the implicit bias that already exists regarding student learning and what it is that they need?
I can take that. Great question, ma'am. I would like to point out three things. So the slide I shared that had belonging highlighted is the same question I posed to you all. What are your dreams, hopes and dreams, right? You're absolutely right? We don't talk enough about students. But the thing is, we, in the traditional sense, when you talk about traditional SEL, we have weaponized SEL, especially when we whitewash it. And it's very easy to weaponize it, and it's contradictory to our equity efforts as well. So when we talk about student voice, we're talking about parrhesia, right? That bold speech, plain speech, allowing students to speak their mind, allowing students to speak and be themselves. That cannot happen if adults are not in a space where they can manage their own emotions, where they're socially and culturally competent to be able to negotiate the lived experience of that lifted, but also allow the agency and belonging to exist. What we are saying is we need to set conditions. There is a strong will, right? But how can we improve the skill set so that when we allow student voice to exist, it's one where it's sustained, one where we can act on it, because it hurts us in the long run when we say we want your opinion. The student gives their opinion, but we don't do anything with it. Or we say you shouldn't feel that way, or it's bad that you feel that way. Then it's contradictory and it hurts us. What we're saying is, how can we build the capacity with adults so that when the student shows up, their lived experience can exist? we can challenge ourselves about not only, again, the self-awareness, why am I feeling this way? Where is my bias? But not just acknowledge implicit bias. What are you going to do about it? And are you socially aware that your own, right? So if you don't believe, for example, in white privilege, right? And you're interacting with a student, that belief system, no matter how hard you repress it, manifests itself in your emotions, right? And your presence. And the thing is, we think sometimes students do not have complex emotions, but to the contrary, they have more, actually research said, they have more complexity in their emotions than we do. And so students are able to sniff that out, right? And so what we want to do with this work is do two things at once. What we want to say is we need to improve adult SEL so that every adult can examine their own beliefs and dispositions, can allow the students to exist in their space with their lived experience, while at the same time creating conditions that would allow the equitable learning to happen in the classroom. One of the things happening right now is curriculum, right? With the EL curriculum that is being rolled out. What does educational equity look like, right? Teresa Chapman is doing a great job with that. And so that's another area. These are things that we're doing as a district across the board to ensure that we are countering the inequities head on. And so that's how we're doing it. And so although if we say student voice but we're not prepared and we don't allow that for sustainability, we will harm ourselves and the students' lived experience will not exist. I hope I answer your question now.
You have. It brings up many others, but I will collect my thoughts on that and send them to the team. I think that this goes hand in hand with our anti-racist work, and it begs the question of what happens if we don't bring our adult population with us, and if they are not able to model, or if they are not modeling this very important work for our kiddos, then what does that look like? Like I said, you've answered my question, but there's a lot more to it, I believe, as well. So thank you.
I just wanted to add one point here regarding what Dow had explicitly shared. And one of the things that we talked about at length around equity, anti-racism, and SEL specifically. And one of the things I think that was maybe the most catalytic point for adult awareness was when we talked about white fragility specifically, and about what is at the root of fragility and how can we specifically address that root without building awareness first, without building understanding and self-competencies first. If we don't take those steps around SEL first, then white fragility is actually is a theory. It's not something that I can even acknowledge or begin to address. So I think that harkens really specifically back to what Dow was talking about in the questions that you continue to ask. So we look forward to that conversation.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I have I'm not entirely sure if it's a question for the team or if it's just maybe a question for my board colleagues or for Dr. Ahart, but I know that we've been focusing a lot on our student governance work, and we've focused a lot in the past on our inputs versus our outcomes. And so I know that a good chunk of this presentation was focused on outcomes, but I guess I don't really know how to word the question, but just in what ways, Dr. Ahart, do you see us focusing more on the outcomes at the board table rather than kind of the inputs moving forward? And I know there's a lot of moving pieces to this plan, and that, the board has a lot of questions, and, I like hearing updates of this nature, but I just wanted to bring the board back to that. So Dr. Ahart, how do you envision these reports? Because we've kind of talked about like this versus the treatment of students and that sort of thing. So what do you kind of envision the future of these reports looking like in terms of updates for the board?
Yeah, I think we need to take a very critical look at our treatment of students and treatment of staff management limitations through the lens of this policy, and perhaps consider folding this, dissolving this policy and folding in folding in these points into treatment of students and treatment of staff. I think that's one thing for consideration. If we've talked about well, kind of two things. One is that until we had this policy fully implemented, these reports were going to be, I think, as you recognize, Ms. Delagardelle, process oriented. Here's here's what the management limitation calls for. Here's where we are in terms of compliance. I think we're essentially there. So then, if we are not going to have a SMART goal, and I do think that's probably the right approach, given how we want to do this work in a transformative way and not artificially narrow the scope of the work to demonstrate success on one particular or two particular data points, then I think we do need to consider a reworking of those two existing management limitations, perhaps through a bit of a different lens, to ensure that we're looking at the actual outputs, the actual results of the work through that lens, rather than a specific narrow SEL lens. Ultimately, as I think Dr. Jacques has illustrated in numerous ways, and Ms. Findlay as well, the importance of the work, there's inherent importance to the work just for the quality of life, the experience that our students and staff have as being a part of the DMPS team. But ultimately, obviously, what we want to see is better outcomes academically and otherwise for our students. And there's a number of ways that SEL, if we do this work well, will positively impact that. So the short answer is, ultimately we should see it in improved academic outcomes for students, as well as other, corollary data, from behavior, et cetera. But I think if we take a different look, and we've actually had this prior to the SEL policy, from my perspective, we've had an ongoing debate about what is the treatment of students report really about, or what should it really be about. And I don't think the board has ever landed on exactly what it is that they want to see from that. So this may be the right opportunity to sort of reframe that conversation. And I would say the same for the treatment of staff as well.
Okay, thank you. And then I do kind of just have a process question, really only in the sense of trying to recenter myself around some work that I know we've done in the past that's related to SEL. I know in the past you've offered like Leader in Me trainings, and the board has read like 40X, and we were doing some Stephen Covey. Is that still happening? Has that all stopped? Is that getting folded in with some of the current SEL work? I guess for me, it's really just that kind of initiative overload of, are we adding new things, or is that kind of getting folded in, or did that go away? I guess just in terms of, how are we supporting our staff in our initiatives?
Well, we've really tried to integrate 40X and how we're doing our work at the cabinet level. So that has not gone away. In fact, that book is on my desk right now, as a matter of fact. And we're very much integrating the Covey work as well. So while the SEL work largely is new, approaching it as a system, and we are spending significant time at the cabinet level with SEL learning. It's within the context of how we're organizing our work with 40X and Covey. So those have not gone away, but we've really worked to integrate that work. So it's not, we don't do Covey and we don't do 40X. It's really become how we do our work.
Okay, so do we still have schools that are Leader in Me schools, or that are still moving that way? Okay. I have some questions and thoughts that are specific to that I'm not going to belabor this conversation with. Just some observations from working in a Leader in Me school that I would love to dig in with someone in terms of like, how does that support equity? And, you know, Dr. Jacques mentioned, you know, the whitewashing, and, you know, Covey is very commercial. It's, you know, very, I don't know, it seems to me that in some ways you're creating students that are going to head off to work, you know, in a place like Wells Fargo. And I just don't know, you know, because it's very corporate culture. And so I guess, like, so my question is, how are we bringing all of these things together? And if that's not a conversation we need to have with the full board, that's just a conversation I would love to have with someone at some point, because it's something I'm really trying to reconcile with myself as a teacher within that system too. And I'm sure there's lots of our other teachers that are doing this type of learning that are curious about that as well. So if that's a conversation we want to have offline, we can.
Sure.
If I may. So, ma'am, would welcome a conversation on that. Like I mentioned earlier, the big question for us is, how does it serve DMPS, right? So although there's a lot of work that has been done across the system, a lot of great starting point, right? One of the key tenets for us is to ensure that we're using SEL as a lever for equity. And so anything that we have in the system or that is happening in the schools right now, we're looking and examining to make sure it serves our people and not necessarily hurting what we're trying to accomplish as well. So I just want to add that, but would absolutely welcome a conversation offline on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll probably send you an email. Thank you.
Is there anything else before I have Ms. Jenkins take the vote?
I'll just add one thing anecdotally, and I want to thank Dow for his assistance, but Oak Ridge was recently awarded a New York Life grant, a $100,000 grant to implement SEL with our middle school students, and Dow has been really helpful in providing some instruction and support to our students. So super excited about being able to give you some reinforcement, at least for our Callan middle schools and our Edmonds elementary students.
All right, Ms. Jenkins, will you please take the vote?
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Ms. Caldwell Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. De La Gardelle,
Yes.
Ms. Martorano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The vote is approved 7-0. The next item on the agenda is consent items. We allow any person the opportunity to speak to the board for up to 5 minutes following the presentation of an agenda item. If anyone wishes to speak to an agenda item, please email aaron.jenkins@dmschools.org. Remarks must be germane to the agenda, and we ask that you avoid reference to personality and character attacks, as those types of comments serve no productive purpose. We appreciate your input. As a reminder to the board and public, the board will not engage in discussion or deliberation with the speaker regarding comments made to agenda items. Discussion and deliberation will remain among board members at the board table, with speakers' comments informing said decision, deliberation, and determinations as deemed necessary. Ms. Jenkins, do we have any speakers?
We do not.
Okay. Ms. Martorano, I believe you have the consent motion.
I move that the board approve the consent items in accordance with the recommended action for each item on the consent agenda, including bills previously authorized, certified, and approved for payment by the board secretary in the amount of $2,582,337.31.
Is there a second?
Caldwell Johnson, second.
We have a motion by Ms. Martorano and a second by Ms. Caldwell Johnson. Any discussion or questions?
I have a couple of questions regarding item D4. It's my understanding that the bids are coming in over budget and that we were going back to Drake to potentially discuss redesigns or adjustments to that plan. And I'm just curious where we're at, or are these bids still coming in over budget, where we're at with redesigns, what's being eliminated from the plans, and what timeline are we looking at regarding this item?
Yeah, so we went out for bid once, rejected the bids because they were over to the tune of about 3 million. We went back and did some value engineering with Drake and RDG, and went back out to bid, and our lowest responsible bid was closer, but still off by about 1.3 million. So we are currently working with Drake. We have a list of things that we could eliminate, either eliminate or reduce the scope of. But the biggest issue is that materials costs, construction materials costs, have in many cases quadrupled over the last year. There's a general consensus that that climb will stop, and as supply chains get more in line, that things will start coming down a bit. And so we don't have a defined time for when we will go back out to bid. We continue to meet with Drake. We've had multiple meetings over the last 3 weeks on this topic. We have a few alternates that we can put into the bidding, and then we're trying to watch very carefully the market, so that we go back out to bid at a time most strategic for both contractors, and when it will be most likely to be in the best position to give us their best price, but also in terms of materials, because just a 10% reduction in materials costs, which is not out of which is not out of the real realm of possibility, would put us right back in the hunt for an on target bid.
Any other questions or discussion?
I had some questions regarding D7, the boardroom audiovisual upgrade, and regarding the cost of those items. Dan Warren has clarified that, but I do wonder if when the time comes, when we do receive the ESSER funds for that item, if it would be more responsible of us to go out to bid on that. And I can continue to have conversations with Dan Warren regarding that. It just seems like a big dollar amount to replace without going out to bid and just using the same company that we have in the past.
Ms. Martorano, I know you brought that up, and also reaching out to Dr. Ahart as well. If you want to continue that conversation, please make sure that you reach out to Dr. Ahart as we continue to work on that project so that we can get back into the boardroom. Ms. Jenkins, could you please take the vote?
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Ms. Caldwell Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Della Gardell,
Yes.
Ms. Martorano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The consent items are approved 7-0. The next item on the agenda is we have one informational only item. That is item number 1, Head Start Policy Committee meeting minutes for May of 2021. Next on our agenda is item of privilege. Do we have any board members that have any comments to share?
I would like to say to our entire DMPS LGBTQ plus community, I affirm and celebrate your identity. I am an ally, and may we celebrate inclusion and welcome everyone regardless of race, sex, gender, or other illusions that may cause separation. Happy Pride.
Thank you, Ms. Martorano. Anyone else? I would just like to give a shout out to our students who did graduate over the last weekend. Also want to give a shout out to our teachers and our staff as the year is coming to a close. We do appreciate all of the work that you have done. We thank everyone for hanging in there. We know that it was not a tough year, and everyone experiencing different things. But we do thank you, teachers, continuously for the work that you've done, staff for the work that you've done, and students for the work that you've done in the classroom or in your virtual space as well. So I just want to say congratulations to everyone for getting to the end of the year, and for staff, all of the work that you've done. I also want to let the community know that at our next board meeting that we will have on the 15th, we will be discussing third grade reading for all students, and we also will be discussing our third grade Black males in reading. So you will hear us having those monitoring conversations, along with the board will take a deep dive into their own self-evaluation as a board. So I just wanted to let you know what to expect for our next upcoming meeting. And also, if you notice that even though we started a little late today due to technical issues, we will be starting our meetings at 5:30 going forward. And we have changed our agenda just ever so slightly. So we appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to starting that next meeting on the 15th at 5:30. I will now turn it over to Dr. Ahart for the superintendent's report.
Thank you, Ms. Bradley. I want to give a special thank you to Mike Vukovic, our director of high schools, as well as the administrative teams at each of our high schools, including Virtual Campus and All Points Academy and Focus and Ruby Van Meter. The last two graduations, FY20 and FY21, have been interesting challenges, and you've met those challenges with creativity and class. And this weekend was really a testament to the persistence and determination that we're going to provide our students with the best experience we possibly can. And even had our first outdoor graduation ceremonies, and thankfully the weather cooperated, and we had just beautiful ceremonies both at Drake Stadium for Roosevelt and Williams Field for East, in addition to the other wonderful graduation recognitions. And finally, just a huge, sincere thank you to the entire DMPS team. We have the end of the school year within sight, just a few days away, and it wraps up what has been clearly the most challenging time in DMPS and public schools in general over the last 15 months. And so thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I look forward to seeing some of you over the summer, as we have greatly expanded our summer programming. And when that's not happening, please take care of yourselves and get the much deserved rest so we can come back firing on all cylinders in August.
And I'm jamming too. I muted, so just the talking away, and I was muted. Just want to thank our community for tuning in this evening and hanging with us for our board meeting. I also want to thank my board colleagues for your conversation and your questions. And thank you again, Dow, Jake, and Allison, for your presentation on the SEL work. We greatly appreciate the work that you do. And this meeting is adjourned at 7:26 p.m. We will begin in about 5 minutes our work session on anti-racism and our guardrails for smart schools.